On March 14, 2025, just after 6:40 a.m. London time, a sealed communication reached senior officials inside Buckingham Palace. It did not arrive through the press office. It was not routed through public relations teams. According to people familiar with the matter, it was delivered directly to a restricted legal channel used only when the situation carries institutional risk. What followed was not a debate, it was an assessment. The message, sources say, originated from Prince Harry's legal representatives in California and was framed as a final attempt to reopen dialogue. On the surface, it appeared measured, calm language, carefully chosen phrasing, but inside the palace it was read very differently. According to insiders, the message was interpreted as an ultimatum. Behind closed doors, senior advisors reportedly reached the same conclusion within hours. This was not reconciliation, it was pressure. And in royal terms, pressure changes everything. At the center of the message was a proposal. Prince Harry would cease further legal action against British media outlets. No new lawsuits, no additional testimony, no future public escalation. In return, he expected something significant: access, restoration, a path back into royal duties under a revised arrangement. Sources close to the palace say the response was immediate and severe. The offer was not reviewed as a peace gesture. It was examined as potential coercion. That distinction matters. Within the monarchy, there is a clear line between negotiation and threat. According to people familiar with the internal reaction, this message crossed it. The palace did not see a son seeking healing. They saw a litigant attempting leverage. One senior figure reportedly described the situation using a phrase that stopped the room cold. "This is no longer a family dispute. This is a risk event." That assessment triggered protocol rarely activated in modern times. Legal files were reopened, timelines reconstructed, prior court filings were re-examined alongside recent testimony. The goal was not reconciliation, it was exposure control. What advisors allegedly found raised serious concerns. According to multiple sources, the legal campaign Prince Harry has relied on as leverage is now under scrutiny for reasons that extend far beyond press regulation. Allegations circulating within legal circles include irregular witness statements, disputed signatures, and communications that appear inconsistent with sworn testimony. These claims have not been publicly adjudicated. No court has issued a ruling, but internally the palace reportedly viewed the pattern as dangerous. And that danger explains what happened next. Instead of engaging, the palace went silent. No counteroffer, no response, no meeting scheduled. Doors that were once closed quietly were, according to insiders, locked permanently. Prince Harry believed the message would force a conversation. Instead, it triggered a review that reframed everything. This is where the story changes. Because while Harry was focused on gaining re-entry, the institution was focused on distancing itself from potential legal fallout. And once that shift occurs, the outcome is rarely reversible. What happened next would widen the divide, harden positions, and bring Prince William firmly into the center of the response. And it would raise a question the palace can no longer ignore. What happens when a royal fight turns into a liability? To understand why that message was treated as a threat rather than an olive branch, the palace had to look backward before it could move forward. According to people familiar with internal discussions, the moment forced advisors to reassess the full trajectory of Prince Harry's departure from royal life and everything that followed. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from official duties in early 2020, the move was framed publicly as temporary and negotiable. Behind the scenes, sources say it was treated as a permanent severance unless strict conditions were met. Those conditions were made clear at the Sandringham meetings. You are either in or out. There would be no hybrid status, no part-time royalty, no selective duty combined with private monetization. At the time, Harry appeared to accept those terms. Public statements emphasized independence, freedom, and a desire to build a new life outside the institution. But according to palace insiders, that acceptance never translated into closure. Instead, a pattern began to form. Within months of relocating to California, Harry initiated legal actions against multiple British media organizations. By mid-2021, those lawsuits had expanded in scope and tone. What began as claims of unlawful information gathering evolved into a broader moral crusade against the press itself. To the public, this was framed as a fight for accountability. To palace legal advisors, it looked increasingly like escalation. To individuals familiar with the situation, the sheer volume of claims raised eyebrows. By late 2022, Harry had either sued or threatened to sue nearly every major tabloid publisher in the United Kingdom. Some cases were consolidated, Others dragged on. The litigation became constant. And with that came another shift. Sources say Harry's public identity began to center on grievance rather than service. Interviews, documentaries, and eventually his memoir reinforced a narrative of betrayal. Family members were portrayed as complicit. The institution was framed as hostile. Silence from the palace was interpreted as cruelty rather than strategy. But internally, silence served a different purpose. According to palace protocol, engaging publicly in active litigation is a liability. Any statement can be subpoenaed. Any comment can be weaponized. The more Harry spoke, the quieter the institution became. That silence, however, did not mean inaction. Behind the scenes, advisors tracked the progression of the lawsuits carefully. According to people familiar with internal reviews, inconsistencies began to surface. Statements given in one filing did not always align with claims made elsewhere. Dates shifted, descriptions evolved, memory appeared selective. This did not automatically imply wrongdoing, but it raised flags. By mid-2023, the legal posture had shifted again. Harry was no longer just a claimant, he was becoming a witness, and witnesses are held to a higher standard. According to legal analysts consulted by the palace, this transition carried risk. Testimony under oath introduces consequences that public interviews do not. Any discrepancy can be challenged, any exaggeration exposed. At the same time, Harry's financial situation was changing. Sources familiar with the matter say the cost of maintaining private security in the United States became a growing burden. Estimates discussed internally placed annual expenses well into 7 figures. Unlike in the United Kingdom, where security is state-provided for working royals, in California the cost fell entirely on Harry. That financial pressure coincided with a noticeable change in tone. According to people close to the palace, Harry's communications became more urgent. The language shifted from independence to contribution, from separation to service. The idea of a revised role began to circulate privately long before it surfaced publicly. This is the context in which the ultimatum landed. From the palace perspective, it did not arrive in isolation. It landed on top of years of litigation, public criticism, and mounting legal complexity. Advisors were not evaluating intent, they were evaluating exposure. And that exposure, they believed, was growing. What they found when they looked deeper would elevate concern to something more serious. Because the legal war Harry had relied on as leverage was now beginning to generate risks, the institution could not afford to share. And this is where the story moves from background to revelation. What palace advisors reportedly uncovered during that internal review changed the entire calculation. According to people familiar with the process, the issue was no longer whether Prince Harry could return in some limited capacity. The question became whether the institution needed to distance itself entirely. The trigger was not one document or one allegation, it was a convergence. According to sources, legal teams working alongside external counsel began mapping timelines across multiple cases. Statements submitted to the High Court were compared against prior filings, interviews, and sworn declarations. What emerged was not a single contradiction, but a series of inconsistencies that followed a recognizable pattern. Dates did not always align. Descriptions of events shifted subtly between filings. Details that appeared firm in one document softened in another. Individually, each discrepancy could be explained. Collectively, they raised concern. This is where authority entered the picture. According to individuals familiar with the matter, advisors consulted former prosecutors and forensic litigation specialists who had experience handling complex perjury risk. These were not media lawyers. They were experts in witness exposure and evidentiary collapse. Their assessment, sources say, was blunt. Once a witness's credibility is questioned, everything else becomes fragile. That assessment carried weight because Prince Harry was no longer positioned as a symbolic claimant. He was expected to take the stand, to testify under oath, to answer questions that would be designed not to clarify but to destabilize. According to legal analysts, this is where cases often unravel. Cross-examination does not focus on the main story, it focuses on the margins, the offhand comment, the footnote, the phrase used differently 3 years earlier. One answer that does not match a previous record can shift a case from civil dispute to credibility C. Receives. And that is when the most serious allegations surfaced. According to reports circulating within legal circles, a key witness connected to Harry's legal campaign disputed the authenticity of a statement attributed to him. The claim was explosive. He allegedly asserted that a document bearing his name did not reflect his words and may not have been authorized at all. This was not a tabloid rumor. According to sources, it was raised formally through legal channels. The implication was immediate and severe. If a witness statement is disputed, the court must determine how it was created, who drafted it, and under what circumstances it was submitted. That inquiry does not stop at the witness. It expands outward. People familiar with the situation say this is the moment the palace stopped viewing the litigation as external noise. It became internal risk. Because if questions arise about document integrity, they do not remain confined to one case. They follow the witness, they follow the legal team, and they follow the individual whose name anchors the claim. That individual in this case was a prince. According to people familiar with the palace reaction, advisors immediately recognized the danger of proximity. Even indirect association with allegations of forged documents or witness pressure carries reputational consequences the monarchy cannot absorb. The situation worsened when reports emerged of alleged intimidation. Sources claim that the same witness expressed fear regarding the fallout of disputing the statement. His legal representatives reportedly requested accommodations that are rare in civil proceedings: remote testimony, protective measures, controlled disclosure. Those requests, according to people familiar with court procedure, signal one thing: escalation. This was no longer about press ethics, it was about legal conduct. At this point, advisors began asking a question that reframed everything. If these proceedings collapse, who absorbs the damage? The answer, they concluded, could not be the crown. Which brings us back to the ultimatum. From the palace perspective, Harry was offering to halt future litigation in exchange for reintegration. But advisors now believed the most dangerous phase of the legal exposure had already begun. Stopping new cases would not neutralize existing ones. The threat was not forward-looking, it was already present. And that is why the response hardened. Because once the possibility of perjury, document manipulation, or witness coercion enters the frame, institutions move to protect themselves first. What advisors reportedly saw next would reinforce that instinct and connect this legal storm to a much darker contradiction. And it involved the very people Harry claimed to be fighting. What complicated the situation further was not just the legal exposure itself, but the company being kept along the way. According to people familiar with the filings, names began appearing in the background that created immediate discomfort inside royal offices. These were not neutral figures. They were individuals with documented histories tied to the very practices Prince Harry has publicly condemned for years. According to multiple sources, members of Harry's legal team had engaged consultants with past convictions related to unlawful information gathering. This was not framed as rumor. It was treated as an unavoidable fact acknowledged in court records and prior judgments. The contradiction was stark. On one hand, Harry positioned himself as a moral reformer. On the other, his case relied on individuals whose professional reputations were built inside the very system he claimed destroyed his life. Palace advisors reportedly saw a pattern forming. First, there was the shifting narrative across legal filings. Then, the disputed witness statement. Now, the involvement of controversial operators with criminal histories. Once again, it followed the same structure. An action framed as righteous. A tactic that crossed ethical lines. And an explanation offered only after exposure. This was not the first time this pattern appeared. People familiar with earlier disputes noted similar behavior during prior legal battles, where public messaging emphasized victimhood while private strategy relied on aggressive and unconventional tactics. According to individuals with direct knowledge, palace analysts began connecting these incidents as part of a consistent approach rather than isolated decisions. This is when the situation moved from concerning to serious. Because institutions do not judge intent, they judge risk. According to former officials consulted during the review, the issue was not whether Harry believed he was right. It was whether his methods could expose the monarchy to collateral damage. The answer appeared to be yes. At this stage, advisors reportedly conducted what they described as reputational contagion analysis. In simple terms, they asked how far the fallout could spread if the cases unraveled publicly. The answer was unsettling. Court transcripts would be reported globally. Opposing counsel would highlight inconsistencies relentlessly. Every contradiction would be framed as deception, and every association would be scrutinized. Silence from the palace would not protect them, proximity would implicate them. This is where Prince William's role becomes impossible to ignore. According to sources close to Kensington Palace, William had already concluded that reintegration was impossible, not because of emotion, but because of pattern recognition. He reportedly viewed the situation through a long lens. What happens when future cases arise? What happens when testimony conflicts with past interviews? What happens when legal defeat turns into public grievance? The answer was predictable. Escalation. This realization reframed Harry's so-called peace offer. From William's perspective, it was not reconciliation, it was risk transfer. Bring me back in, and the institution absorbs what comes next. That was unacceptable. According to people familiar with the internal response, this is when the tone shifted from debate to finality. The palace did not need to announce a ban, they simply closed the path. No meetings scheduled. No intermediaries authorized. No negotiations entertained. The silence was deliberate. Because when institutions believe someone is operating inside a destructive cycle, the only safe response is distance. And that distance would soon become visible to the world in a way Harry did not expect. As the implications of these connections became clearer, reaction spread quickly across multiple layers of influence. It was not loud at first, it was cautious. Observers noticed a shift in tone rather than an explosion of outrage. Major outlets began adjusting language. Commentary moved from sympathetic framing to conditional phrasing. Words like alleged, disputed, and under review appeared more frequently. Analysts who had once defended Harry's legal crusade began emphasizing uncertainty instead of certainty. Inside the legal community, that shift mattered. According to people familiar with how high-profile litigation is assessed, momentum is everything. When confidence wavers, support follows. Several commentators who previously framed Harry as a reformer began asking quieter questions. Why were certain witnesses distancing themselves? Why were filings being amended? Why did explanations arrive after exposure rather than before? At the same time, notable voices chose absence. No public statements came from senior royal offices. No rebuttals were issued by palace lawyers. No clarifications were offered on Harry's behalf. That silence did not go unnoticed. When accusations are false, responses tend to arrive quickly. They are direct, they are emphatic, they aim to shut narratives down before they spread. But here's nothing. Despite repeated requests, no comprehensive denial addressed the specific claims circulating in legal circles. Statements focused on general principles, not details. Broad reassurances replaced point-by-point rebuttals. The absence of a response became part of the story. According to media analysts, silence in high-stakes disputes often signals one of two things. Either counsel has advised against speaking due to legal exposure, or facts remain unsettled enough that denial would risk contradiction later. Both interpretations carried weight. Industry observers also noted changes in professional behavior. Invitations slowed. Panel discussions quietly excluded Harry's representatives. Advocacy groups previously aligned with his cause became less vocal. This was not a cancellation, it was disengagement. One former advisor described it as strategic distance. When uncertainty grows, institutions step back to avoid association. Public reaction followed a similar path. Social platforms reflected confusion more than outrage. Many people expressed frustration not with what was alleged, but with what was unanswered. Questions accumulated without resolution. Why were timelines unclear? Why did narratives shift? Why did legal filings contradict earlier statements? Each unanswered question weakened credibility. Meanwhile, sources indicate that behind closed doors, legal teams were urging restraint. Speaking now could limit options later. Silence, though uncomfortable, preserved flexibility. But silence also allowed interpretation. And interpretation filled the vacuum. This is when the situation crossed another threshold. It moved beyond reputation management and into long-term consequence territory. Because reputations are not destroyed only by proof, they are eroded by doubt. And doubt, once introduced, is difficult to reverse. As this phase unfolded, attention turned to what came next, not what had already happened, but what future testimony might reveal and what risks that testimony carried. That question would soon dominate every internal discussion. Once doubt entered the equation, the stakes rose quickly. What had begun as a reputational problem now carried the weight of potential legal consequence. According to people familiar with the internal assessments, advisors stopped asking how to manage optics and started asking how to limit exposure. The most immediate concerns centered on testimony. Prince Harry was no longer a symbolic figure making statements from a distance. He was a named participant in ongoing proceedings. That distinction mattered. Testifying under oath introduces a level of risk that public commentary never does. Legal analysts consulted by palace advisors reportedly emphasized one point repeatedly. Consistency is everything. When a witness has spoken publicly many times, written a memoir, and given interviews across multiple platforms, every word becomes discoverable. According to former prosecutors, this creates what they call a perjury trap. Not because someone intends to lie, but because memory, interpretation, and emphasis shift over time. A detail remembered one way in a book can be recalled differently on the stand. That gap is where cases turn. And the consequences are severe. In the United Kingdom, perjury is not symbolic. It is a criminal offense. Even the suggestion of misleading testimony can trigger further inquiry. That inquiry does not stay confined to one case. People familiar with the matter say this risk was spelled out clearly. If testimony conflicted with prior sworn statements, opposing counsel would seize on it. If inconsistencies multiplied, judges would notice. If credibility collapsed, outcomes would follow. This was not speculation, it was procedure. The risk extended beyond Harry himself. According to individuals close to the palace, advisors worried about institutional contamination. Even indirect association with proceedings involving allegations of dishonesty, forged documents, or witness pressure could harm the crown. That is why distance became non-negotiable. At the same time, financial implications came into focus. Legal battles at this scale are not cheap. Costs accumulate quietly, then all at once. Security expenses, legal retainers, expert witnesses, travel, and compliance add up. According to security consultants, maintaining private protection in the United States can cost several $million annually. That bill does not pause during litigation. It accelerates. Sources suggest this financial pressure was not abstract, it was immediate. This reframed Harry's proposal to return in a limited capacity. From the outside, it appeared like reconciliation. From the inside, it appeared like cost transfer. If reintegrated, certain expenses would shift back to the institution. Security, logistics, and legal insulation would follow. That reality was not lost on advisors. Which is why the answer hardened. Not because of punishment, because of liability. Every institution has a threshold beyond which support becomes exposure. According to people familiar with the decision-making process, that threshold had been crossed. The calculus was no longer emotional, it was structural. And that structure could not bend. As these consequences settled in, attention turned to the present moment, where things stood now, what remained unresolved, and what might still surface. That uncertainty is where the story remains. As of now, the situation remains unresolved, but it is far from static. According to people familiar with the matter, no formal pathway back into royal service exists, no discussions are scheduled, no intermediaries are authorized to explore options quietly. The distance that formed earlier has hardened into policy. Publicly, nothing has been announced. Privately, the position appears settled. Prince Harry remains outside the institution, navigating multiple legal fronts without palace support. His legal team continues to advance arguments already on the record, while palace offices maintain deliberate silence. That silence is not temporary. It reflects a decision already made. Yet several questions remain unanswered, and they continue to drive attention. First, how will sworn testimony unfold if and when it occurs? According to legal observers, that moment carries the greatest risk. Once testimony begins, narratives must align precisely. Any deviation will be examined in real time. Second, what happens if disputed documents or witness claims expand? Sources say investigators are watching whether additional statements emerge that challenge existing filings. Even one more contested account could widen scrutiny. Third, where does institutional authority draw its final line? While distance has been established, formal actions have not yet followed. Titles, roles, and legal status remain technically unchanged. That gap invites speculation. Fourth, how sustainable is the current posture? Legal proceedings move slowly, but consequences accumulate. Public patience, financial resources, and professional alliances are not infinite. People familiar with the internal view say advisors are watching for three signals: a shift in legal posture, a change in representation, or a recalibration of public messaging. Any one of these could indicate a new phase. Until then, uncertainty persists. What is clear is that reintegration is no longer the central issue. Risk management is. The institution has chosen containment over reconciliation. That choice shapes every response, including the absence of one. Observers note that this is not a dramatic standoff. It is administrative resolve, quiet, methodical, final in tone. And it leaves one final question hanging. If events continue on their current path, who ultimately decides the endgame? The courts, Parliament, or the slow erosion of relevance? That question leads directly to how this story closes, at least for now. This is where the story settles into a colder, quieter phase, not with resolution but with consequence, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but reshapes everything underneath. For years, the narrative centered on reconciliation, on whether bridges could be rebuilt, on whether time and distance might soften positions. That narrative no longer fits the facts on the ground. What has replaced it is something far more final. According to people familiar with the internal mindset, the institution has shifted from reaction to insulation. The goal is no longer to manage fallout. It is to ensure that whatever happens next happens at a safe distance. That decision carries its own weight. Institutions like the monarchy survive by absorbing pressure slowly over decades. They do not gamble on uncertainty. They do not hinge their stability on individuals whose trajectories are unpredictable. When patterns repeat, institutions respond by narrowing exposure. That is what appears to be happening now. Prince Harry's position is no longer defined by what he wants, but by what the system can tolerate, and tolerance has limits. The legal path ahead remains uncertain. Proceedings will continue. Testimony may be given. Outcomes will arrive in stages, not all at once. But one thing is already clear to those watching closely. The door he is facing is not locked because of anger. It is closed because of risk. And risk, once identified, is rarely reintroduced. Observers note that the most telling development is not what has been said, but what has not. No counteroffers, no trial balloons, no quiet briefings suggesting a thaw. Silence has become policy. That silence tells its own story. As this unfolds, attention will shift again. From whether Harry can return to what happens if he cannot, from reconciliation to consequence, from family drama to institutional survival. Those watching closely know this is not the end. It is the pause before the next disclosure, the next filing, the next decision that removes another option from the table. History rarely announces its turning points in real time. They become clear only later, when paths quietly disappear and do not return. This appears to be one of those moments. And whatever comes next, it will not be negotiated through ultimatums. It will be decided elsewhere.